Have you ever wondered how a man so strong, who single-handedly defeated armies, was ultimately brought down by a woman? Samson, the strongest man in the Bible, met his downfall at the hands of Delilah. But what led this woman to betray him? Greed, fear, or something even darker? Today, we will uncover the layers of this betrayal and understand how Israel's greatest hero fell, not in battle, but by choice. What really happened? Stay until the end and discover the truth behind one of the Bible's most tragic stories. Samson's story begins long before he was born, during a time of deep suffering and prayer. Manoah, his father, and his wife, an unnamed woman in the scriptures, carried the sorrow of infertility. In that era, childlessness was seen as a curse, and there was no greater desire for a couple than to have an heir. Manoah and his wife's fervent prayers seemed unanswered, until one day something extraordinary happened. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife while she was alone and announced that she would conceive a child despite her barrenness. This child was to be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the womb until the day of his death. Moreover, he was given a divine mission to be Israel's deliverer, a man chosen to free his people from the oppression of the Philistines, who controlled much of Israel's land at that time. This announcement was more than just good news. It was a supernatural event that marked the beginning of a much greater divine plan. Samson was not merely the long-awaited son of his parents, he was God's promise for the redemption of his people. His mother was given specific instructions on how to care for him. She was not to drink wine or eat anything unclean, and most importantly, the boy's hair was never to be cut. The Nazirite vow was a symbol of holiness, a separation for God. And this consecration was the key to the divine strength Samson would carry throughout his life. Each strand of hair that grew on his head represented a direct connection with God, and as long as he remained faithful to this vow, God's strength would stay with him. Samson grew up with the awareness that his life was not his own, that he was unlike other children. While his friends played freely, he knew his mission was far greater. The rules and vows he had to follow were not just religious traditions, but signs of his dedication to a divine purpose. The strength he possessed was not of his own making. It was a direct gift from God, placing him in a unique position. He was not just a strong man, he was a man chosen to deliver a nation, but growing up with such a great purpose also came with challenges. Samson soon realized that although he was immense, powerful, and gifted with extraordinary abilities, he was not free from human temptations. His journey would not be without failure, and in moments of weakness, he would give in to his own desires. The first sign of this came in his choice of a Philistine wife, which greatly troubled his parents. This was a reflection of Samson's inner struggle between his calling and his personal desires. He was drawn to this woman, despite knowing that she was not part of God's plan for his life. When Samson, still young, approached his future Philistine wife, his parents were reluctant, knowing that such a union would not bring blessings to Israel. However, Samson was determined and declared that this marriage would be an opportunity for him to begin his fight against the Philistines, as God had destined. This decision revealed an aspect of his personality. He was focused on his mission, yet he often made impulsive choices that over time would prove disastrous. Samson then began his journey of heroic deeds. He defeated formidable enemies and brought overwhelming victories to Israel. But what made him special was not just his physical strength. It was the presence of God in his life. In one of his most iconic battles, Samson single-handedly killed a lion with his bare hands, a feat impossible for any ordinary man. Later, in another memorable battle, Samson's divine strength was evident once again, but this time he used an unusual weapon, the jawbone of a donkey. The scene was set on a plain where 1,000 Philistines stood ready to fight him. Confident, In their numerical advantage, the Philistines surrounded Samson, believing they could easily defeat him. But what they didn't know was that Samson was not fighting alone. Though the field was filled with heavily armed enemies, Samson, with his incredible strength, picked up the discarded jawbone of a donkey. This improvised weapon, seemingly weak, became a lethal tool in the hands of a man empowered by divine strength. Samson wielded the jawbone like a club, striking down Philistine after Philistine. He didn't just defeat them, he crushed them, like an unstoppable warrior driven by a force beyond the physical. However, the Philistines were beginning to realize that Samson was not just a legend, he was a real threat to their rule, and at any moment they could take drastic measures to neutralize him. It was in this growing tension that Delilah entered Samson's life, turning his story into something even more tragic. The story of Samson and Delilah begins when he had already established himself as a hero in Israel. His unmatched strength and extraordinary feats made him a legendary figure, and he was revered by his people. However, despite his victories and the strength that accompanied him, Samson was, above all, a man like any other, susceptible to human weaknesses. And it was in this vulnerability that Delilah entered his life. Delilah was not just a woman of breathtaking beauty. She was someone with a clear objective, someone who had been chosen, either by her own ambitions or by external pressures, to play a role that would change Samson's destiny. She lived in the valley of Sorek, a region situated between Israel and Philistine territories, placing her in a strategic position close to Samson's enemies. Her life was intertwined with the Philistines, and she knew that if she succeeded in bringing down Israel's strongest man, she would gain not only financial rewards, but also security and power. Delilah was approached by the Philistine leaders, who were desperate to uncover the secret of Samson's strength. They knew that the only way to defeat him was to find the source of his power. Through an agreement, Delilah accepted the mission of discovering Samson's secret, and through several attempts, she gradually got closer to him with a cunning that few could detect. She used her charm and persuasion to win Samson's trust, making him believe she was someone he could fully rely on. Overcome by his passion for her, Samson failed to realize he was being manipulated. At first, Delilah did not directly ask about the secret of Samson's strength. She began with subtle questions, trying to uncover indirectly what made him invincible. Samson, though immensely strong, was vulnerable to human desire, and Delilah knew exactly how to exploit this. It was when she started using her femininity and emotions to manipulate Samson that the game truly began. She did everything to earn his trust, becoming his confidant and seemingly his devoted partner. Delilah's first attempt was subtle. She asked Samson if there was anything that could make him weak, if there was a way to defeat him. He laughed and responded with a lie, saying that if he were tied with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would become as weak as any other man. This was an opportunity Delilah did not let slip away. In the dead of night, while Samson slept, she tied him with fresh bowstrings and called the Philistines to attack him. However, with his divine strength, Samson broke the bowstrings as if they were mere strands of hair, and the Philistines fled in panic. Delilah, however, pretended to be surprised and demanded an explanation. Unaware of what was truly happening, Samson once again brushed off the conversation, believing that she was simply unaware of her actions. But Delilah did not give up. With each failed attempt, she became more determined. Her persistence was what truly set her apart from Samson's other enemies. She knew that the real battle was not about physical strength, but emotional manipulation. Delilah took advantage of Samson's passionate heart, pressuring him further until he started to give in. He, who had never shared the secret of his strength with anyone, began to open up. This was not out of genuine love or trust, but because of the emotional manipulation Delilah had carefully woven around him. With each passing night, she drew closer to her goal. Delilah's pressure increased day by day, and finally, exhausted and unable to resist any longer, Samson revealed the secret he had kept for so long. "My strength comes from God," he said. "If my hair is cut, my strength will vanish, and I will be like any other man." These simple yet profound words marked the point of no return. Delilah listened intently, and though she seemed moved, she was merely waiting for the right moment to act. When Samson fell asleep, she immediately summoned a man to cut his locks, and what once seemed impossible happened. Samson's strength vanished. Now that she knew Samson's secret, Delilah made the decision that would change the course of her life and the history of Israel. With the revelation of Samson's divine strength, she did not hesitate to act. During the night, while he was in a deep sleep, she carried out what had been meticulously planned. Delilah had Samson's hair cut, the symbol of his covenant with God, and without his knowledge, his strength was gone. But what Samson did not realize was that the loss of his physical strength also meant the breaking of his divine purpose. When Samson awoke, he did not immediately feel any different. He was used to waking up and sensing his power. But that day, something was wrong. As he noticed his enemies, the Philistines, approaching, he tried to react as he always had. But to his shock, his body did not respond as usual. The strength that had allowed him to defeat thousands of enemies was no longer there. He tried to stand and fight, but the chains the Philistines had brought were unnecessary. He was weak, powerless. The man who had once faced entire armies now lay on the ground, unable to resist. His confidence in his own physical strength had been his greatest downfall. The Philistines, seeing Samson's vulnerability, advanced without hesitation. They captured him with ease and took him to Gaza, the Philistine city, where he was humiliated and ridiculed. The man who had once torn down the city gates was now being used as a spectacle for the entertainment of his enemies. They gouged out his eyes, a cruel and symbolic act, ensuring that he would never see the light of day again. But the humiliation did not stop there. He was forced to work at a grinding mill like a slave. The man who had once dominated battles was now reduced to an object of mockery, pushing a heavy stone day after day. Samson's fall was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. He had been chosen by God for a great purpose, yet now he was blind and captive, humiliated by those he had defeated so many times. But while in captivity, Samson began to reflect on his life. He realized that his true strength had never come from his muscles or his hair, but from the presence of God. He had failed, but God had not abandoned his people. Even in his humiliation, Samson found an opportunity for spiritual renewal. Over time, his hair began to grow again, a sign that the covenant between him and God could still be restored. The growth of his hair symbolized not just the return of his physical strength, but also the possibility of returning to his divine purpose. Blind and weak, Samson began to understand the true meaning of his life and mission. He now knew that his great feats were not merely acts of human strength, but demonstrations of God's power. The key to his true strength had always been his faithfulness to God, and now, at his lowest point, he was ready to surrender to God in a way he never had before. While Samson remained a captive, humiliated in Gaza, the Philistines were celebrating their victory over Israel's hero. They organized a grand festival in the temple of Dagon, their god, to showcase the downfall of the enemy they had once feared so greatly. The temple was filled with Philistines, leaders, soldiers, and civilians, all rejoicing in their triumph. Samson's humiliation was the highlight of their celebration, a way to mock everything he had stood for. The people cheered, toasting and dancing in victory, while Samson, blind and shackled, was led among the Philistines like a trophy, guided by a young servant. As he entered the temple, the crowd fell silent for a moment, an involuntary respect for Samson's presence. Despite his blindness and disgrace, there was still something about him that unsettled his enemies. When he was positioned between the temple's two main pillars, Samson ran his fingers over the cold stone, feeling the cracks and imperfections in the columns. He knew what needed to be done. It was no longer about revenge or rage. It was about fulfilling the purpose for which God had called him. There, before his enemies and in the face of his imminent death, Samson fully remembered who he was and the role he was meant to play. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible. Samson, physically weak but now filled with renewed faith and determination, prayed to God in a different way. He was no longer asking for victory out of pride or arrogance. His prayer was a cry of repentance, a sincere plea for divine strength. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. He knew his life was nearing its end, but he also knew that even in his weakness, God could use him for something great. This moment marked Samson's spiritual transformation from a man arrogant and reliant on his own strength to one who now depended completely on God. With his feet firmly planted on the ground and his hands gripping the columns, Samson felt the energy he thought he had lost. It was as if the weakened muscles in his body were being filled with a supernatural force. With one final effort, he pushed against the columns. At first they resisted, but then small cracks began to form in the stone. The crowd, which had been laughing and mocking him moments before, fell silent as they felt the ground begin to tremble. The columns started to give way, and the entire temple began to collapse. With a final cry, Samson used all his strength to bring down the columns, causing the temple to crash down upon the heads of his enemies. The sound of the collapse was like thunder, and the earth shook beneath the Philistines' feet. The temple fell, killing not only the Philistine leaders, but also thousands of soldiers and civilians who had gathered for the festival. Samson's final act was one of sacrifice, a complete surrender of himself, and he did it for a greater purpose. In his death, he fulfilled God's calling to deliver Israel, even if it was in a tragic and sacrificial way. Samson's sacrifice was an act of redemption. Though he had failed many times throughout his life, his death brought victory to Israel. By giving his life to destroy the Philistines, Samson fulfilled his final mission, and his sacrifice became a symbol of God's strength, a strength that can turn even moments of greatest weakness into something extraordinary. Though the strongest man in the Bible had fallen, he rose again in spirit, and his downfall became a victory for his people. After Samson's death, Israel experienced a temporary victory over their Philistine oppressors, but his legacy was not just in the battles he won or the final sacrifice he made. What endured was the lesson his life left behind. God's strength is greater than any human strength, and a man's true power does not lie in his physical ability, but in his faithfulness to the divine purpose. Through both his failures and triumphs, Samson became a symbol of human strength and fragility, reminding the people of Israel that God is sovereign and that even moments of downfall can be used to fulfill his plans. Samson's legacy is also marked by the tragedy of his relationship with Delilah, the woman who betrayed him. Her role in the biblical story, though often viewed with contempt, is not entirely simple. Delilah, with her beauty and cunning, was the only woman who managed to deceive the strongest man in history. Unlike Samson, she did not possess incredible physical strength, but she knew how to manipulate his emotional weaknesses. Her betrayal was undoubtedly one of the greatest acts of deception and manipulation in the Bible, and she played a crucial role in the downfall of Israel's great hero. However, Delilah did not act solely out of malice or greed. While the Bible does not fully reveal her motivations. It is evident that she was under various pressures. Perhaps it was the promise of wealth and power that drove her, or maybe she feared the consequences of refusing to help the Philistines as she lived among them. What we do know for certain is that Delilah was manipulative and shrewd. She did not care about the destruction she would bring upon Samson and Israel, using his love as a tool to achieve her goals. Delilah also represents the temptation that can lead anyone to fall. She did not appear as a direct enemy, but rather as a friend eager to please, making Samson believe she was worthy of his trust. This emotional manipulation was key to her betrayal. She knew that Samson trusted her, but she never imagined that this same love would become the weapon that ultimately led to her downfall. Delilah, with her game of seduction and deception, became a central figure in the fall of the hero. Delilah's fate after Samson's death remains unknown. There are no further biblical records of her life after the betrayal, but her role in history leaves a lasting legacy. She is not just a traitor. She is an example of how human motivations can be complex and filled with ambiguity. The story of Delilah, like that of Samson, reminds us that even the greatest heroes have weaknesses, and that true power lies in recognizing our vulnerability and trusting in God, not in our own strength. Moreover, the story of Samson and Delilah teaches us about the consequences of poor choices. By giving in to temptation and revealing his secret, Samson brought not only his own downfall, but also suffering to his people. Delilah, on the other hand, by choosing betrayal for personal gain, lost the opportunity to live by higher principles. This story, with its highs and lows, serves as a lesson about the choices we make and their impact, not just on our own lives, but on the lives of those around us. Samson's story is not just about physical strength and military victories. It is about redemption and fulfilling a divine purpose. Despite his flaws and weaknesses, he was chosen by God to be an instrument of deliverance for Israel. The tragedy of his life does not diminish the greatness of his mission. Rather, it makes his final sacrifice even more meaningful. Samson was not just a hero, he was a reflection of how God can use even the darkest moments to fulfill his plan. Samson's greatest act of strength was not when he defeated 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, or when he tore down the gates of Gaza. His greatest act of strength occurred in his death, when he sacrificed himself to destroy the temple of Dagon and defeat the Philistines once and for all. Samson's sacrifice was a complete surrender of himself to God's purpose. He understood that his true strength was not in his body or his hair, but in his connection with God. By submitting to the divine plan, Samson finally fulfilled his mission as Israel's deliverer, even though it was in a tragic way. Samson's downfall, caused by his human weakness, was a moment of great reflection. Blind and humiliated, he finally recognized that his strength was not something he could control or possess on his own. His true strength came from his faithfulness to God. When he prayed in the temple of Dagon, asking God for strength one last time, he was not asking to win a battle for his own glory, but to fulfill the divine plan, even if it meant his death. His moment of downfall was also a moment of redemption, for he surrendered himself to God completely, and the final victory was granted by God, not by his own strength. Samson accomplished what seemed impossible, bringing down the Philistine temple and defeating them in a single act of faith. In doing so, he not only fulfilled his destiny, but also showed the people of Israel that God's power is greater than any enemy. His death was not in vain. Though it came in a moment of weakness and suffering, it was also an act of sacrifice that brought freedom to Israel and broke the long-standing oppression of the Philistines. Samson's sacrifice is an example of the power of redemption. Even in his failure, he found an opportunity to be used by God in a way that no one expected. His downfall was, in fact, the means to a great spiritual victory. The God who had chosen Samson before his birth had not abandoned him but used him even in his weakness to fulfill his greater purpose. This reminds us that even in our lowest moments, God can still use us to accomplish his will. Samson was a man of weakness, but his weakness became the key to the great victory that God achieved through him. The story of Samson is one of the most powerful lessons on strength, weakness, and redemption. He was not just an invincible man, but someone who, through his failures, learned the true source of his strength. Delilah's betrayal, his downfall, and his final sacrifice remind us that even though we may be chosen by God, our choices still matter. The story of Samson challenges us to reflect on where we seek our strength and how, even in our moments of weakness, we can find redemption. Have you ever wondered what truly makes you strong? Sometimes our strength does not come from where we think it does. Are we placing our trust in the wrong things, just as Samson did? What lessons can we take from Samson's fall and redemption in our own lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what this story means to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning from stories that transform lives.